Hey church, welcome and thank you for worshiping with us. Wherever you're worshiping, in your home or on your TV, laptop or phone, you are a part of this family. And you could watch or listen to past messages by heading to mycornerstone.family. On our sermons page, you can view playlists, search for past messages, and more. You can even listen to our content by subscribing to the Cornerstone America's podcast, which can be found on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. I hope you enjoy the message and thank you for being a part of the Cornerstone family.
Let's get ready to jump into my message. If you go to my next slide, next week we're starting a new series. We're wrapping up Peter. We've been in it for about 12 weeks now. We're getting into our Christmas series, The Promised King, starting it next Sunday. But as we wrap up 1 Peter, we're in chapter 5, verses 1 through 14. And in this text, Peter is writing and talking to three groups of people. He's writing to the elders, he's writing to the young people in the church, and he's writing to all the people in the church. So he's writing to the shepherds, the servants, and the saints. And he has something to say to all of them. And we start out in 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. And it's interesting that he uses three terms here. He says, to the elders among you I appeal, be shepherds of God's flock. And then he says, watching over them. So these three terms that he uses interchangeably, but all addressing a Christian leader in the church. And so if you go to my next slide, although they're three words, they're used for the same person. And so one word in the Greek is we translate as elders, and it means old in spiritual maturity or spiritually mature. The other one is pastor or shepherd, and usually has the idea of a person who's caring and leading and feeding the flock. And then overseer or bishop talks about the managing job of a pastor. So three terms that the New Testament will use for church leaders, but all expressing a different job function or responsibility with that job. Now, it's interesting that the word elder is picked up from the Jews. They pulled that into Christianity, made sense. They used it in the synagogues. It talks about those that are older, those that have spiritual maturity. So they brought that in. But the New Testament regularly mixes up these three terms and uses them interchangeably. Again, he says, to the elders among you, I appeal, be shepherds of God's flock, talking about caring for the flock, and then watching over them, giving oversight to the flock. And so these three terms having a place. We also see this in Acts chapter 20, verse 17 and 18, and verse 28, where these three terms are also used interchangeably. Paul sent to Ephesus for the elders of the church. When they arrived, he said to them, guard yourselves and all the flock to which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers. And then he says, be pastors of the church of God, using all three terms again to relate to the same leader. Now, we could talk about how different denominations have grabbed onto one of these three words and used it as kind of a focal point for their denomination. And that's okay, there's nothing wrong with that. But here at Cornerstone, we don't make a big deal out of titles. I don't think Jesus made a big deal out of titles. In Matthew chapter 23, verses 7 to 11, Jesus said this, talking about the Pharisees. He said, they love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and so to be called rabbi by others. They were interested in titles. Jesus wasn't very interested in titles. He says, but you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher and you are all brothers. And do not call anyone on earth father, for you have one Father and he is in heaven. Nor are you to be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant. Again, Jesus is not saying that titles aren't important or authority figures don't have a place, but he was downplaying because they have a tendency to be abused. And so he talked about humbling ourselves and letting God exalt you at proper time. And so at Cornerstone Church, we have titles and they're needed, but we don't put a heavy emphasis on there because it's really about serving Jesus. And you don't need a title to be a servant. You know what servants do by nature? They serve. We don't need titles to serve. The greatest calling in our life is a call to serve. Jesus came to serve and not be served. And so we don't play it big when it comes to that. So this is where we're at. Now, as we talk about leaders, because the first part of this text, he says to the elders. And I don't want us to think today as we go through the first part of this text that we should just think about the elders in this church, or we should think about paid staff for this. But let's widen our scope a little bit for what we're talking about today. And let's put anybody who is a church leader into the text. So what I'm going to talk about this morning, at least in the first part of this, where he's talking to the elders, applies to anybody that's in leadership in a church. So if you lead a life group, or you head up a ministry team, or you're helping lead on a ministry team, whatever capacity it might be, or you're helping with the youth, or helping with children's ministry, you're helping celebrate recovery, put yourself in this text. Peter is talking to us. So let's talk about it. Verse 1, he says, to the elders among you, I appeal as a fellow elder and a witness of Christ's sufferings, who will also share in the glory to be revealed. Here's the thing about church leaders pay the price of leadership. That there is a price to be paid. And when he's talking about Christ's suffering, Peter is not just a witness to Christ's sufferings, he's also entered into Christ's sufferings. He went through persecution. This church that he's writing to was going through persecution. And I think what he's saying is church leaders pay the price of leadership, that we also enter into the sufferings of Christ. And sometimes that means persecution, as this church was going through. Remember, that's one of the primary reasons why Peter was writing this letter. In 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 12, he says, dear friends, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come upon you to test you, as though something strange was happening to you, right? It says persecution. Church leaders pay the price of leadership. We pay the price of persecution, maybe being misunderstood. We sacrifice for the sake of the gospel. But we keep on going. Peter was writing to them to encourage them to keep on going. How about this? Church leaders care for people. In verse 2, he says, be shepherds of God's flock and under your care. Be shepherds of God's flock that is under your care. Church leaders have a heart for people, have a heart to care for people, to serve people. We ought to have a heart for serving others. We ought to have a heart for helping others. And I think we see that in our church as we get into these serve days or outreaching or just being generous, that we see that we have a heart to just help people. You know, a lot of pastors, a lot of church leaders have different giftings. Whether evangelistic or administrative, the list goes on, tons of gifting. They may have different personalities, introverted or extroverted. But here's something that every church leader ought to have, is they ought to have a heart that cares for people. That ought to be at the root and core of who we are. Church leaders care. We care for people. And if you're a male, then you ought to care for people like a father cares for his children. And if you're a woman, you ought to care for people as you're their mother, and wanting to see the best for them and to sacrifice and to help them grow. It's interesting that how many leaders in the Bible were actually real shepherds. It's interesting, this idea of a shepherd taking care of a flock of sheep. It's how Jesus likes to talk about church leaders taking care of people. Here's the other thing, that church leaders are watchmen. They oversee. Look at verse 2. He says, but shepherds, he says, be shepherds of God's flock that is under your care, watching over them. Notice he says, watching over them, giving oversight, protection, looking out for them, seeing what trends are coming, what the culture is selling us that we need to be on guard against, being careful about division among the flock. So giving oversight. I love one of the pictures I have when I think of overseeing a flock, that we have sheep and goats in our backyard, and we got a couple livestock guardian dogs. And I love how they at times sit and just lay in the yard and just surveying the backyard, making sure that nothing bad, this is their life. And they care for the goats and the sheep. They make sure that no harm comes to them. And they just keep their eyes out and they're watching. In fact, some years ago, we had these two great Pyrenees dogs, and many times at night, you would see them split up. One would take one side of the yard, and one would take the other. I see that as church leaders giving oversight over the flock, over the body, bringing care, watching over them, and not because they must. Notice the motive here, not because they must. It's not because I have to, but because you are willing. There is a willingness there. There is a desire just to care for people. This is not I should or I have to, it's I get to. Man, I get to serve others. I get to bless others. I get to do this. This is the way we should look at it. He says, but because you are willing, notice, as God wants you to be. This is the way we should be. Shepherds giving oversight. Well, this word oversight is like telescope. You got this telescope out and you're keeping an eye on what's going on around us. That's how we ought to be. That's how church leaders ought to be. And it's really desire over duty. For us, it's not a duty, it's a desire. God has put this desire in our hearts. But he keeps on going, not because you must, but because you're willing. He says, as God wants you to be, notice here, not pursuing dishonest gain, but eager to serve. Here, church leaders choose being generous, giving over getting. Not pursuing dishonest gain, but eager to serve. I mean, it's not a career. It's not like this tricky maneuver in your vocational life to become a minister or to become a church leader. It's about serving. It's about helping others. It's not a career, it is a calling. And he keeps on going in verse 3. He says, not lording it over. It's not about control. It's about being an example. Church leaders are examples. He said, not lording it over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. It's not about control, but it's about being an example. Here's the thing. We're never going to change the world or change people by ordering them to do things. We're not going to change the world. We're not going to change people by controlling things. The way we make changes is by leading by example. If you want to make a big impact on your family, it's not going to come from telling them what to do or what not to do. It's going to come from leading by example. If you want to make a big impact on your kids, it's not going to come by just, there's got to be rules, we got to tell them what to do, but the bigger impact is going to come from leading by example. If we want to make an impact on this community, it's going to come by us leading by example. And that makes a lasting impact. This word example in the Greek actually means it's like a press. It's like you put an imprint on something. If you want to leave a mark on this world, we're going to do it by leading by example. And church leaders lead by example. This is the way we learn. Think about how much our kids learn, not because they're reading a book, not because they went to school, but simply watching us. Isn't it amazing how much our kids pick up just by watching us, just by listening to us? Sometimes listening too much to us. You ever catch your kid when our kids were younger, like, where'd they get that word from that they're saying? Oh, you say it. I do? They're listening close. We learn best by example. We don't learn best by books or classes. We learn best by example. We need some examples that we can see. We need some good examples. Church leaders lead by example. Verse 4, he says, and when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the crown of glory that will never fade away. This is what he says to the church leaders. And he goes on, he talks to the younger people there. He says, in the same way, verse 5, in the same way, you who are younger, submit yourself to your elders. He goes, you guys got some good elders there. They're leading by example. They're doing some good things. Submit to their leadership. Learn from them. Grow with them. Work with them. And then he goes on in verse 5, part B, he says, then all of you. He starts talking to all of them there as he's wrapping up this letter. He says, all of you, clothe yourselves with humility toward one another, because God opposes the proud but shows favor to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Notice he says, stay humble. To the whole church, he says, all of you, clothe yourselves with humility. Put on humility. Why? Why should we put it on? Why should we have humility toward one another? Because God opposes the proud. Pride is destructive. It's one of the main reasons why our families fall apart, our communities fall apart, because of pride. And he's saying, watch out for pride. Put on humility. Stay humble in all you do. Humble destroys relationships. Pride destroys relationships. Are you guys awake? You listen to me? Pride, I know I caught you sleeping there. Okay. Pride destroys relationships. You want to see your family break down fast? Pride will do it. Humility builds it up. Humility brings it together. Man, pride says, I want to control. I want to control God. I want to control how he's going to answer my prayers. I want to kind of control my life. I want to control those around me. That's how pride responds. That's how pride acts. Humility releases all that and says, I'm not God, and I'm just going to pray for God to move and to work. I'm going to try and line my prayers up as much as possible with his word and pray that through. I'm going to try and live my life submitted to him and submitted to those around me. And yeah, I want what's best for everybody, but I'm not going to try and fit them into my mold. My mold may not be right for them, but I'm going to pray that God would mold them, God would shape them, that they would follow God with their lives, that they would look more and more like Jesus. I'm not trying to make people look like me. I want people to look like Jesus. Humility says, I'm depending on God. I can't do it on my own. I can't rule the world. I can't control my life. There's lots of things I can't control. Humility acknowledges that and releases it to God. Jesus is so humble. Philippians chapter 2, Jesus humbled himself even to the point of death, sacrificing himself, an example of his humility. And he calls us to do the same, to follow him with humility. Stay humble. Are we staying humble in our closest relationships? Are we staying humble in life? The next one is, he says to everybody, give God your worries. Verse 7, he says, cast all your anxiety upon him because he cares for you. Cast all your anxiety, not some of it, all of it, on him. Cast it. Now, this word cast is like a fishing rod. Man, you put the bait on there and you cast it out. And sometimes we do that with our worries, but then eventually we reel it back in and we hold on to it again. That we may wrap it around the hook again and cast it back out and then reel it back in. There was a guy who was fishing and he wasn't catching anything. And this little boy was sitting there, like he was catching fish after fish after fish. And he asked him, said, how are you catching so many fish? And the boy mumbled something. And he asked him again, how are you catching so many fish? He mumbled something again. So he walked over to him closer. He asked him, said, how are you catching so many fish? And he spit a worm out of his mouth. He said, you got to keep the worms warm. Is anybody ready for lunch now? I think sometimes we feel like we got to keep our worries warm. We hold on to them. We just nurse them. We've got to cast them. It's not just casting them out and bring them back in, but we cast them on God because he cares for us. I think sometimes we think like holding on to our cares is like a workout. We think, man, if we can just get more cares on here, we can handle it. Our muscles will grow stronger and we'll be able to handle these better and better. Here, the thing is, holding on to our worries and our cares is not like working out with your muscles. You put resistance against your muscles, they grow stronger. You put worries on your muscles, they will wear you out. Physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. We weren't made to carry them. We were made to cast them onto somebody else who can carry them. And that's God. He says, cast all your anxiety upon him. And here's the reason we do it. Because we know he cares for us. Not only that he cares for us, that he's big enough to take care of the problem in the situation. That's the encouraging thing here. Cast them upon him because he cares for us. He can do way more than we can do. So we cast it. We cast our cares. We throw it on him. Are we doing that? Worry is letting the problem work on us. But prayer is you and God working together on the problem. Which would we rather do? And here's part that goes with worry. Colossians chapter 3, verse 2, he says, set your mind on things above, not on earthly things. Set your minds on things above. Part of casting our care on worry is setting our mind on the things of God, not the things of this earth. We've got to keep our mind focused on the things of God. That's the only way we can continue to cast our worry upon him. Worry, we look at the future and think about what bad can happen. Hope is when we look to the future and see what God can do. Are we looking forward with hope? And then he wraps up this section by talking about standing firm in the face of opposition. He says in verse 8, be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. Resist him, standing firm in the faith, because you know that the family of believers throughout the world is undergoing the same kind of suffering. That we are not alone. What the devil would like to do is tell us that all of our problems are unique and nobody is going through what we're going through. And then he would like to tell us that the giftings and how God has made us, we are just ordinary. But the opposite is actually true. The things that we go through are very ordinary. There's no temptation that is uncommon to man. We all struggle with the same things. But your potential is unique. God made you different than any other person on the face of this earth. There's only one of you. He made you different. And when we stay humble and we give our worries to God, we can stand firm in the face of opposition, knowing that God will bring us through. In verse 10, it says, and the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, after you have suffered a little while, will himself restore you and make you strong, firm, and steadfast. Will you stand with me this morning as we get ready to close in prayer? And as you stand, let me ask you a question. As Peter was talking to all of them, he's talking to us. What area do you need to stay humble in? What areas maybe the devil tempting you to be prideful in? Man, I can do this in my own strength. I can do this in my own ability. Would you humble yourself this morning? What worries have you this morning? What worries have gripped you throughout this week? What is it that you need to cast on God this morning? What worries have you been trying to control and fix and make it work in your own strength? What do you need to give to him this morning?